My name is Amy Weinkoff. I'm a DataX Research Fellow at Princeton University's Center for Information Technology Policy. The paper I'll be discussing in this video is entitled Artificial Concepts of Artificial Intelligence, Institutional Compliance and Resistance in AI Startups. I authored this research paper with Elizabeth Ann Watkins. Researchers, advocacy groups, and technology companies have created guidelines and tools for developing ethical artificial intelligence to ameliorate the considerable negative social impacts produced in AI systems. But the real-world utility of available interventions for ethical AI remains unclear, especially when translated into emerging organizations such as technology startups. Like mature companies, startups must navigate complex dynamics among stakeholders like investors, clients, and regulators. But unlike more established organizations, they must do so under significant resource constraints that threaten their very existence. As a result, the ethical AI practices they're able to adopt are necessarily limited. We contend that before ethical AI practices for startups can be developed, an understanding of the interorganizational and institutional dynamics these firms face must first be developed. Building on recent scholarship that takes a contextual and organizational approach to ethical AI, we engage in descriptive research around the life of AI as a discursive concept and organizational practice that's situated within an institutional context. To this end, we ask two foundational research questions. First, what institutional pressures influence how startup entrepreneurs define, discuss, and build AI? And second, when do entrepreneurs comply with, avoid, or resist these pressures? To address these questions, we conducted semi-structured interviews with 23 individuals working at early-stage startups across a range of industry domains. In our interviews, we focused on the financial, regulatory, and normative pressures AI startups encounter. In this video, I'll briefly touch on some of our core findings. The need to signal legitimacy to sources of financial support, such as investors and clients, constituted a significant source of influence on how entrepreneurs defined, spoke about, and developed practices for AI. A tension that arose repeatedly in our interviews derived from a conflict between institutional values, specifically between the values of careful and conservative scientific practices and the values of rapid innovation and aspirational vision in technology entrepreneurship. AI entrepreneurs attempted to mitigate the conflicts by decoupling their external rhetoric from their day-to-day internal practices. One way this decoupling manifested was through the use of AI as a concept itself. Entrepreneurs leveraged the concept of AI as a symbol of their technological proficiency, even though they personally harbored disdain for the technical ambiguity of the concept. Entrepreneurs emphasized that most clients and investors don't have the technical background required to adequately evaluate an AI solution. As a consequence, entrepreneurs face institutional pressures to describe their technology using homogenized, hype language about AI, even though their underlying algorithmic approaches were heterogeneous and often quite carefully devised. External stakeholders' beliefs about the potential of AI also created a barrier for entrepreneurs to be transparent in their external messaging about their model's methodological strengths. Instead, we observed institutional pressures around how quality in AI ought to be reported, specifically in external stakeholders' arbitrary notions of what constitutes good model accuracy. In the words of one participant, we have to make sure it's 90% or above. So if we need to switch from top 3 accuracy to top 5, just people seeing a 9, they don't even think about what it's measuring. People just have artificial concepts of what's good and what's bad. That entrepreneurs place a strong value on scientific integrity points towards an ethical opportunity within the startup ecosystem. As several entrepreneurs themselves pointed out to us, models with inequitable outcomes are necessarily less valid since they don't generalize well. Also, they're less able to realize business values since they can't meet the expectations of diverse clientele. Thus, entrepreneurs' values of scientific legitimacy might act as a value lever through which principles of AI ethics can be imported into AI startups. On the other hand, external stakeholders' tendency to treat decontextualized accuracy metrics as a superficial indicator for AI quality is suggestive of a risk for institutional institutionalization of AI ethical ideals, since they could similarly default to arbitrary indicators of model ethicality. Entrepreneurs also demonstrated both conformity with and resistance to institutional pressures surrounding how they finance their businesses. One example of this was heterogeneity in how entrepreneurs regarded venture capital funding. For some, capital from VC firms formed a cornerstone of their strategy for building their businesses. These entrepreneurs saw investors not only as a source of financial capital, but also a valuable industry domain and business expertise, as well as a mechanism for accessing important professional networks. Others actively avoided VC financing. In these cases, entrepreneurs contended that venture capitalists' profit motives and responsibility to their limited partners could conflict with startups' technical or long-term business goals. One entrepreneur told us, "That was my whole experience at a previous startup. The VCs wanted to hype things up, get a lot of press, make a splash so they could raise the next round at a higher valuation and look good to their LPs, which was actually contrary to what we needed to do for the slow growth to build the business." Several entrepreneurs described instead strategically aligning with angel investors or crowdfunding platforms to finance their businesses. Entrepreneurs' desire to match their financing strategies with their business goals and normative values presents an opportunity for ethical practices. Even if AI ethics as interventions are seen as antithetical to profit goals, entrepreneurs might be able to preserve AI ethical ideals by matching with investors who share these priorities, especially if public scrutiny around the ethical implications of investor strategies increases. It is important to note, however, that the entrepreneurs who are able to exercise more discretion in terms of when they seek funding and from whom they seek it are likely already advantaged in the entrepreneurial ecosystem. Thus, this could create an additional source of inequity within technology startup financing. In addition to financial pressures, entrepreneurs often described their compliance with and resistance to pressures in the form of regulation, especially regulations surrounding privacy and the FDA approval process for applications of AI in medicine. On the whole, entrepreneurs viewed privacy protections as normatively good, a competitive necessity, or even a competitive advantage compared to industry peers who are slower to adopt privacy-protecting practices. Unlike privacy regulation, the FDA approval process for AI in healthcare was viewed less favorably. Entrepreneurs who discussed the FDA viewed these regulatory requirements as unnecessarily onerous, sometimes unscientific, and advantaging existing players within the healthcare sector. While privacy regulations were perceived as aligning with the values of personal freedom and autonomy, FDA regulations were seen as a barrier to innovation and autonomy and a mechanism through which industry insiders receive favor from other institutional actors. These contrasting results support both theory and evidence that a mismatch between an organizational field's normative values and coercive regulatory pressures will result in less meaningful internalization of policies. Greater engagement with AI entrepreneurs could improve both policy and its adoption within startups, since active participation from business owners has been shown in previous research to increase regulatory compliance. Institutional theorists posit that emerging organizations can bolster their own legitimacy by adopting the values, structures, and practices of established organizations. That is, organizations can improve their chances of survival by mimicking what incumbent organizations already do. But this idea is in tension with the Silicon Valley notion that the most legitimate innovations are those that disrupt existing ways of operating. In our interviews with entrepreneurs, their rhetoric typically suggested they viewed deep learning models as constitutive of radical innovation and that they distinguish deep learning models from other machine learning techniques. But in conflict with the widespread framing of deep learning as magic or perhaps radical innovation, most entrepreneurs' implementations of deep learning constituted a more incremental form of development that draws on the scientific products of researchers in the AI community. Many entrepreneurs describe relying heavily on transfer learning for their deep learning applications. Thus, in a paradoxical way, entrepreneurs' discursive distinction of deep learning techniques complies with the institutional pressures to seek rapid and disruptive innovation even though the pre-trained models used for transfer learning coordinate the practices of AI entrepreneurs, possibly down to the specific pre-trained models they employ. The widespread use of pre-trained models does raise ethical questions. Word and image embeddings derived from models trained on human data often encode human-like biases such as racial, gender, and other harmful stereotypes. How entrepreneurs adapt pre-trained models to their applications may obviate the transmission of harmful biases from pre-trained models to industry applications. However, some researchers have suggested that the biases of pre-trained models, if not mitigated for their contextual application, could further propagate harms. Thus, our finding supports the call for research to better understand not only the negative social impacts of models developed in academic contexts, but also how these impacts are attenuated or magnified by their applications in industry through transfer learning. On the whole, our research shows that although institutional forces do shape AI startups' beliefs and practices surrounding AI, they don't dictate them entirely. Even if the ethical practices adopted by startups at their outset evolve over time in response to shifting market demands, founders typically have a lasting influence on startups' trajectories, even after they leave the company. As a result, those startups face more resource constraints than the more mature companies that have often been the focus of most applied AI ethics research. They also may be an ideal stage for ethical interventions.